Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about, well, first of all, a victory, and it ties into how subversive ideologies find their way into our public school system, which also ties into why school choice is needed more than ever in Idaho. You may not realize it, but you are living in post-colonial Idaho. I'll explain what that is in just a moment.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. And if you've never heard of post-colonial Idaho, it's probably because you're not sitting in a social studies class in an Idaho public school classroom. But this is something that our kids are going to be learning about. And I'll get to that in just a few moments. But first, let us savor a small victory which took place yesterday. This was actually in the House of Representatives. Biggest win of the day. House Bill 98, which prohibits taxpayer dollars being used for teachers' unions. In other words, the money and resources cannot be used to benefit these public sector unions, passed the House in a 40-29 vote. And of course, the reason this is a good thing is the teachers' unions are slowly losing their grip on our children's education. However, they still have a remarkable amount of influence because if you look very closely at those names there in red, the nays who voted against HB 98, you will see at least 11 Republicans, all of whom were endorsed by teachers' unions. So yeah, they still have a lot of influence and they still have Republican legislators who are willing to do their bidding. So let's delve into an article. This was published by Samuel Lair with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Idaho's proposed social studies standards embrace CRT, but beware, they don't call it CRT. Samuel tells us the Idaho legislature will soon decide whether to approve the newly revised K-12 social studies standards, which we'll just call standards from here forward, developed by the State Department of Education over the past year. Last session, the legislature adopted Senate Concurrent Resolution 116, directing the State Department of Education to create standards that emphasize the history of Western civilization, provide a factual history of our nation, emphasize our founding principles, and cultivate patriotism and pride about the success of this great country. Unfortunately, he says, the State Department of Education seems to have missed the memo. So here's what they would like to be teaching our kids in their social studies curriculum. A close review of the proposed social studies standards reveals that the SDE was far more concerned with celebrating diversity than cultivating civic virtue. Among the standard's most questionable inclusions is a requirement on the origins of Sikhism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, despite these faiths representing less than 1% of Idaho's population. They also seem to believe that it's just as important for students to learn the role of indigenous people, women, African Americans, and immigrants in the American Revolution as it is to learn about the contributions of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson to the founding of our nation. I mean, it's not like they have to be left out entirely, but is it really on a par with what Jefferson and Washington and others accomplished? The first indication, he says, of the standards embrace of post-colonialism, this is the first you're going to hear of this word, is its choice to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, when the Idaho Freedom Foundation inquired why the Standards Committee made this change, a representative from the State Department of Education says, well, it was done in conformance with the 2019 proclamation issued by Governor Brad Little, in which he joined the likes of President Joe Biden and California Governor Gavin Newsom in recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day. Yet despite Governor Little's woke proclamation, Christopher Columbus Day remains the official legal holiday celebrated on the second Monday in October, according to law. Interesting. Now, the article goes on to tell us that the next indication of post-colonial influence in its standards is seen in its frequent use of the politicized term indigenous peoples over traditional terminology. Now, Samuel says, as he explained in a previous article, which, by the way, is linked, if you want to check this out for yourself at idahofreedom.org, in the parlance of critical theory, it's indigenous peoples is meant to invoke an emergent, collective, and globalizing socio-political identity. How's that for some word salad? Premised upon the shared struggle of all indigenous peoples against the global system of oppression imposed by the Western world. So these standards invoke this same understanding of the term by requiring students to develop an awareness of similar experiences of indigenous populations in the world. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with being aware of this, but when you start teaching this in the place of actual history, you can see where it starts to become a little more suspect. The radical political aim of post-colonial ideology is implied within its name. In other words, it seeks to dismantle all existing settler colonial societies by supporting the efforts of indigenous peoples to reclaim their land, ushering in a post-colonial age free from the cultural and political oppression of Western society. In support of this aim, post-colonialism in K through 12 social studies curricula either diminishes or denigrates the historical legacy of our nation's greatest heroes, while glorifying the resilience and resistance of American Indians against colonization. In a similar manner, Idaho's proposed standards ask students to analyze the tribal nation's resistance and adaptations to European colonization. Now, I have to point out here for just a moment, none of this means that the students shouldn't be learning about indigenous peoples or Native Americans, whatever you want to say. But it's very interesting how this appears to be a very concerted effort to drive a wedge in between the students and the actual history of their country, which is something that they should be proud of. And that doesn't mean that, yes, everything was perfect and they never made a single mistake along the way. Of course, mistakes were made, but they need to learn about those too, so they can best ascertain for themselves what worked versus what didn't. This is just kind of, I don't know how to put it. Let's teach them about Fern Gully and the virtues of environmentalism at the expense of learning how to be good stewards. Nonetheless, back to Samuel's article. Like CRT, post-colonialism believes that American society is fundamentally racist and oppressive, which, by the way, is one of those tenets of Marxism or deconstruction theory. In accordance with this view, the NCSS declares that the social studies education has a responsibility to oppose colonialism and systemic racism, which, not coincidentally, they happen to see everywhere they look. So the NCS thus advocates for national social studies curricula to use indigenous perspectives to, in their words, debunk Eurocentric nationalistic origin myths. Again, great word salad there, but are we going to ignore truths? Are we going to ignore literal history that happened? This can result in distorted, biased depictions of our nation's major historical events. For example, the standards reference to the Nez Perce War and the Battle of Bear River, they change it to the Nez Perce Flight of 1877 or the Bear River Massacre. And that's a noteworthy aspect of choosing names that automatically imply that the United States was the villain in these conflicts. In other words, there's a little more nuance than they're letting on. Now, while some of these standards are rather innocuous when viewed in isolation, Samuel Lair says the problem is when they're taken as a whole. The purpose of content standards is to set a broad framework of core knowledge, and school districts are then free to choose whatever curriculum they like, as long as it covers everything covered by the State Department of Education. As written, the proposed standards effectively restrict the curriculum options to those that embrace the tenets of critical race theory and post-colonialism. Surprise, surprise. How does this stuff find its way in here? Well, Samuel says, contrary to the guidance issued to this SDE to establish standards that promote patriotism and pride about the success of this great country, the proposed standards instead are tainted by the subversive ideology of post-colonialism. The youth of Idaho deserve an education free from political indoctrination. The proposed K through 12 social studies standards ought to be emphatically rejected and replaced with standards that are factual, rigorous, and patriotic, in line with the vision laid out by the legislature in Concurrent Resolution 116. I understand some people will say, well, that's indoctrinating them too, but at least it's giving them a more balanced understanding than simply, well, we have to express this in Marxist terms of oppressed versus the oppressor. Nevertheless, one more comment here from Samuel Lair. He says, when textbooks are required to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day and to use the term Indigenous Peoples over traditional terms like American Indian, to teach westward expansion as the product of an ideology, to have lessons on the dangers of ethnocentrism, and to celebrate the roles of Indigenous people, women, African Americans, and immigrants in the American Revolution, schools are being mandated to teach history with a clear ideological bent. And that is a problem because it leaves out some of the important parts of history. Now, I understand. There are those who would say, well, you're just worried you're going to get your feelings hurt if somebody tells the truth. The truth can be told. And I guess this is probably as good a time as any to suggest, if you are serious about really understanding what the historical record can back up, you're going to have to do some of the work yourself. You can't just pick up a textbook where someone says, well, here's what so-and-so thinks about what somebody else thinks about what Thomas Jefferson wrote or said or may have done. Because then you're 2 or 3 degrees of separation. You want to really know what's going on? It's not like Thomas Jefferson didn't leave a lot of writings and correspondence that could be examined. You need to read old books. You need to read books that were written by the people who lived during that particular time period. Now, well, what if they had wrong ideas? Well, guess what? They did. And so do we. We have blind spots in our time too. But if you really want to understand what's happening and what happened, you have to be willing to put yourself into their time period, their mindset, and essentially break out of your own chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis would call it, and stop pretending like, well, we have all the answers, we know everything that's good and everything that's bad, when in fact we have our blind spots too. And somewhere down the road, somebody's going to be looking at us and making similar judgments and saying, well, why didn't they recognize this? By the way, the whole trans thing and medical interventions for kids, that's going to be a curiosity for centuries to come once we get past it. One last note, in the last episode, I talked about David Worley with the Idaho National Guard, who was targeted by leadership that wanted to remove Christians from leadership positions in order to avoid extremism. If you didn't get a chance to see today's Capitol Clarity, which took place earlier, it was so worthwhile. Go to Idaho Freedom TV on YouTube. You can check it out there, and it will be well worth your time to hear him speak and essentially go to the source. Oh, hey, that's kind of like what I was recommending earlier as far as learning history. You want to learn history? Go to the source wherever possible. And don't rely on, people with an agenda to tell you the way it really happened, especially when it involves a lot of word salad and wokeism. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.